It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Brandon Valeriano, who is the Bren Chair of Military Innovation at the Marine Corps University. He also serves as Senior Advisor for the Cyber Solarium Commission and as a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. Dr. Valeriano has published 6 books and dozens of articles for such outlets as the Journal of Politics, International Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Peace Research. His 2 most recent books are Cyber Warfare versus Cyber Reality, Cyber Strategy, both of them published by Oxford University Press. Brandon has written opinion and popular media pieces for the Washington Post, Slate, Foreign Affairs, and Lawfare. He has provided testimony on cyber conflict in front of both the United States Senate and the United Kingdom's Parliament. His ongoing research explores conflict escalation, big data in cybersecurity, the cyber behavior of revisionist actors, and repression in cyberspace. After his remarks, we'll have a question and answer period, and I'd ask you to come to the microphones on either side. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Brandon Valeriano.
Thank you for having me. As you can see, as we say in DC sometimes, I have many hats. I was a liberal arts BA undergrad from Whittier College in California. I was a typical academic, sat in the ivory tower, didn't really engage much, and I moved to DC, and my life changed. And an academic engaged in DC policy is not a typical thing. Most academics don't engage directly with policy. Most academics don't play in this space. And, you know, the reality is there's a reason why. Because it's very difficult. Because it's a tough place to play in. And it may eat me up and chew me out, but I will have a lot of experiences and I will have a lot to say about this process. But what I want to talk about today is something very, very new. It's so new I wrote it yesterday. It's so new I can't even really tell you, where this is going to evolve and how it's going to evolve. But you'll start to see a lot of this process roll out in the next month. And you'll start to see a lot of examinations about the evolution and the role of cyberspace strategy in the United States. And this is something we really need to discuss, we really need to think about, because we haven't really developed our cyberspace strategy that well. We haven't really thought much about novelty. And more importantly for you, we haven't thought a lot about how the technical merges with the strategic perspective in this space. And it's insanely critical to understand how the space operates, but also to understand the challenges in this space. Our country is at risk not only from catastrophic cyber operations, but from millions of daily intrusions disrupting everything from financial transactions to the inner workings of our electrical system. The challenge is deep. The challenge is pressing. The challenge is all-encompassing. The challenge is we built a system for cybersecurity with little thought or orientation towards security. And this is where we must operate from. This is where we must move forward from. The problem is when we have developed strategy in the United States for national security, when we have developed military policy, we have typically done it from a position of ascendance. We have typically done it from a position of attack. We have typically done it from a position of maneuver. The challenge for cybersecurity is that we are insanely vulnerable in the United States, that there is a lot to be said about how we must evolve to meet the needs and the dangers in this space. So for a statement of purpose, I'll lay out a few things. One, there's a clear need for change. Current cyber strategy, current cyber policy is not good enough. It doesn't do enough. It doesn't articulate a clear strategy for how we're going to interact in this space. It doesn't articulate a clear strategy how we're going to engage the public and the private sector together. Number two, we lack clarity. A lot of us have been making jokes about U.S. cyber strategy for the last few years. And one of the things we say is that it's not even clear internally in the United States. If you were to survey 10 policymakers and 10 academics and ask them what persistent engagement means, or ask them what U.S. cyberspace policy is, you would not get consistent answers. And that's a problem. Because more importantly, we don't have clarity for our allies and our adversaries. Strategy demands clarity. Strategy demands communication. The whole importance of strategy is obviously generally about communicating what your strategy is to get the opposition to change their behavior. That's what coercion's about. But how do you coerce an adversary when you're not exactly clear with your strategy in the first place? And third, we need a true strategy that conceptualizes the means and ends of action. This has been the most disappointing thing for me as an academic engaging DC policy, is that we have a conception of what strategy is. Strategy is about a means to achieve an ends. The challenge, though, is that in DC, when you often make strategy, you often think of the means, and you don't think of the ends. You don't think of an end state. You don't think of an objective. You don't think of measuring success. And this has been a huge problem for U.S. strategy for a long time, but especially since the war in Iraq and the wars in Afghanistan. And we continue to meet this challenge, and we continue to shirk our duty in thinking about how we evaluate success. We continue to fail to think about how we evaluate the effectiveness of our strategies. And these are key challenges and key tasks for anyone making strategy. You want to know if your strategy is effective. If your strategy isn't effective, you need to change. You need to change course, you need to change direction. But too often in the United States, we develop a strategy and we don't necessarily think about how we can evolve it. We don't think about how we can make it better. Mainly because change is hard. Change is difficult. The people who make these strategies often don't want to talk about the inherent logical contradictions or the inherent challenges in their strategies. We don't often think about interrogating ideas in U.S. strategy. But that's what we think about quite often in academia. That's the whole point of academia, to break down an idea and then to build it back up. But we don't do that very often in U.S. strategy. So the problem statement, the more connections people make and data they exchange, the more opportunities adversaries have to destroy private lives, disrupt critical infrastructure, and damage our economic and democratic institutions. So there's a huge challenge. There's a huge threat that we have to meet. And in meeting this threat, particularly for the United States government, speed and change are not our friends. You know, many of us would probably recognize we need a cabinet-level organization for cybersecurity or information. That many of us would recognize we need to evolve and change U.S. national government. That we need to rethink the structures of the very institutions that we hold dear. But change is difficult. The last cabinet agency we made was the DHS in response to 9/11. And that exactly didn't go very well. We're not particularly suited to react quickly and to react agile in this space. And we all know in cyberspace, speed and agility are probably the most important factors. And this is something we have to deal with as a large bureaucracy and a large government. How do we react with pace and speed in this space? And of course, there are limitations of digital liberalism. Being a liberal state, being a democratic state, means that we have challenges that other states don't have. Other states like Iran can cut off information. Other states like China can just delete things and ignore things. It's not something we're able to do in the United States. This is a challenge that is particularly unique to democratic systems, but it puts democratic systems on the back footing in cyberspace. Our modern way of life depends on the integrity, confidentiality, and availability of data. But how do we ensure that? How do we start to think about making that that critical function of modern day life secure. That's something we haven't really done too well. We haven't met that challenge. And I think a lot of people have just kind of accepted that we will always be insecure in this space. But there are things that we can do to ensure security, to build security, to move towards a positive path. We can evolve as a U.S. government, as a strategy organization. But we need thinkers, we need ideas, and more importantly, we need novelty. But novelty is tough. The threat landscape, of course, we have Russia. Russia seeks to disrupt U.S. interests wherever they stand. It seeks to counter U.S. interests, mainly because American interests directly counter Russian interests. China directly right now is generally focused on the challenge of espionage and building databases and building methods to counter U.S. Intellectual property. Iran and North Korea seek to degrade and disrupt the United States, seek to move forward with their nuclear weapons programs, and they seek to counter us by challenging us in a space that they can compete in, which is cyberspace. Criminal actors, of course, there's the critical importance of industrial espionage now. Of course, we have criminal actors, stealing through ATMs, basic credit card theft, but the larger threat of industrial espionage, insider threats, industrial challenges is more pressing and likely more devastating to the integrity and the stability of the United States. To date, the United States has not sufficiently changed the cost-benefit calculus made by adversaries when determining whether or not to attack in cyberspace below the threshold of armed conflict. And this is our challenge. You can likely argue that we have deterred adversaries from disrupting our way of life in such a way that it shuts down the power plants, it destroys the water, it does things of a devastating consequence that demand conventional responses. What we haven't done is delineate a space below the threshold of armed conflict that we seek to prevent, that we seek to deter. We haven't made clear what we don't want done in order for the opposition to stop. There's a clear need to communicate what path we want to take in the future, and we haven't done that well enough. Principles. One, deterrence is possible in cyberspace. And that's strange for me to say because as an academic, I've been on the forefront of challenging the idea that cyber deterrence can happen. But the reality is it can. But the thing we've missed more often than not in our discussions about deterrence is not so much about cost imposition and challenging an adversary, it's more about survival in the first place. It's more about deterrence. It's more about defense. If you think back to Dr. Strangelove and that great movie, their concern was about going to the bunkers. Their concern was about survival and how the system will thrive in a moment of crisis. We haven't done well enough to articulate how we will survive as a digital entity in response to cyber crises. We haven't developed a whole society solution to the challenge of cybersecurity. Generally, what we have done is developed departmental strategies, military strategies. But to meet the challenge of cybersecurity, we need the whole entire apparatus of the government to work with the private sector. This is the first space or domain or area we have acted in where the government is not the primary actor. The private sector is the primary actor. The private sector is the main vector of attack. How do we deal with that issue? How do we solve that challenge? To do that, we need a whole society strategy. But generally, we tend to think of these things as a whole of government or whole of department strategy. We need more than that. And that need is really enfranchised in the idea of a functional public-private collaboration. We don't have that. We have a great disjuncture or a seam between the public and the private. We need to do better. We need to share information. We need to share standards. We need to share regulations. We need to be on the same page. And right now, the government and the private sector are just not on the same page. Currently, the main articulation of U.S. strategy is articulated in the idea of persistent engagement. And persistent engagement is a cyber command strategy to go forward and to hunt the adversaries and to impose costs and to impose friction against our adversaries where they stand. The challenge of persistent engagement, though, is that, for one, there's no end state in the strategy. The name persistent engagement suggests that conflict is endemic and persistent. But that's not what we witness in cyberspace. In cyberspace, conflict ebbs and flows. It goes in waves. There will be agreement between presidents, and conflict will decrease. And then that agreement will be torn up, and conflict will increase. There are patterns in cyberspace, and we must understand that. Conflict is not persistent. It's not enduring. It can change, and it will change with the ebbs and flows of the diplomatic currents in international politics. Cyber conflict, as I mentioned, is not continuous. It's not always all-encompassing. There are things you can do to stop the challenge. There are things you can do to punish adversaries. Persistent engagement isn't even a whole of department strategy. It orientates out of Cyber Command, but it's not a strategy the Department of Defense has necessarily adopted. The Department of Defense, their preferred term of art is defend forward. So you see the problem. We have United States Cyber Command articulating a vision of persistent engagement, and then a few months later, the DoD released the U.S. cyberspace strategy that articulates the theory of defend forward. Similar concepts, but they're not on the same page. So we don't even have a whole department strategy. We need to at least get the Department of Defense on the same page, but more importantly, we need all the U.S. government on the same page. And finally, persistent engagement represents a degenerative strategy. Now, this is something you may come across at some point in your academic career. You may come across it in grad school. But there's the idea of a Kuhnian revolution. There's the idea of throwing off the yoke of conventional theory and moving forward and disbanding one idea and coming up with a new idea. You know, evolution, gravity, all these things are examples of evolution of theory that might represent revolutions. The problem, though, is that you can also have degeneration. You can have a path backwards. And persistent engagement embodies that because it doesn't move us forward. It only speaks to a particular aspect of cyber conflict and a very small aspect of cyber conflict, friction between adversaries. A clear strategy for the United States government needs to do more than that. It needs to articulate the ends, ways, and means. It needs to include a public-private partnership, and it needs to be clear what cost imposition means and how we're going to signal cost imposition. So in short, our current strategy embodied by persistent engagement is not enough. We need more. And this is what the more may possibly be: layered cyber deterrence. You may start to see this more and more in the news. You may start to see this more and more in the coming months. It may become U.S. national strategy. It may not. Who knows? But we're at the forefront of the evolution of the change of U.S. cyberspace strategy right now. The idea behind layered cyber deterrence is to reduce the probability and impact of cyber operations. There's a very clear goal and a very clear objective to lessen the nature and the breadth of threats coming into the United States. The way that would happen is through 3 stages. 1, we need to shape behavior. We need to think more about, as Joe Nye says, entanglement. We need to enable collective action for our partners and our allies. We need to leverage non-military instruments of power, legal instruments. And more importantly, we need to change the ecosystem at which competition emerges. We need to think more about the system that we operate under. We need to think more about norms. We need to think more about what you may call a global society. All these things are important and cannot be ignored in cyberspace, because if you're going to impose costs, you need to impose costs under a system where there can be collective action to punish aggressors. Number two, you need to deny benefits. This is something we have failed at more often than not in the past. We have not built solid defenses. We have not built secure and critical networks outside of the defense industrial base, the DIB as we call it. We have not enabled deterrence by denial, which would mean strong defenses and resiliency in the critical infrastructure that we depend on. And then finally, we need to impose costs. We need to think about deterrence by punishment, but that requires clarity on what is being discouraged. That requires signaling on what our policy particularly is. We need to be ready to prevail by employing a full spectrum of our capabilities and a time and place of our choosing. But we need to understand what that full spectrum of capabilities might be and how that works. We need to think beyond cyber responses in the cyber domain. We need to think about all levers of U.S. national power. To move forward with our strategy, we need to reform a few things. One, strategic reform. Defend forward is a term of art we're going forward with. The U.S. must proactively observe, pursue, and counter adversaries' operations and impose costs short of armed conflict. But to do that, we need to delineate the space below armed conflict where actions are to be discouraged. We need to be clear as to what we're trying to prevent. We need clarity, and we need some sort of method of understanding just what is to be denied. We haven't done that well enough. We haven't talked about electoral security until fairly recently. And even now when we talk about electoral security, we do it in a very limited fashion in some ways. We need to be clear about the threats that we're trying to prevent. We need to institute a new vision of norms and collaboration. Norms can have an impact on how states operate. They don't need to be norms in the sense of an international legal standard with an international legal code and an international tribunal. Norms are just agreed upon shared standards of behavior. And countries from time to time have delineated patterns and norms that they agree on. We have done that through the UNGGE in agreeing that critical infrastructure and damage to civilians is not to be condoned by cyber operations. But we haven't done enough to enforce and enfranchise these norms. We need to update the national cyber strategy. We need a clear national cyber strategy. We need a clear strategy that speaks to all levers of U.S. government, not just U.S. Cyber Command, not just the Department of Defense, not just the Department of State, and not just the DHS. And you understand the problem by how I list as many organizations are involved in this space. That's the challenge, is we have a lot of actors in this space and we don't have a lot of clarity of roles. We need to reform the government for action. And we need to reform the government for the challenge that cyberspace represents. We need societal reform. Cyber insurance can be useful, but right now cyber insurance is almost meaningless. There's no certifications, there's no standards, there's no clarity of data. There's no clarity of what cyber risk may be, likely because we're not clear about the dangers in cyberspace and we don't collect enough information and share enough data in this space. We need to reform the supply chain. This is going to be our biggest weakness as a modern democratic state, that we have depended on and we require the collaboration of many different countries in building our industrial base. But we haven't ensured that it's secure. A GAO report by the US, on the U.S. military weapons acquisition systems said that up until 2014, every weapons system we bought was vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. You know, think about that. Everything we bought up until 2014, probably longer, is vulnerable to a cybersecurity threat. We need to think more about ensuring the supply chain. We need to think more about data and information sharing. In innovation, any form of innovation, data and information is the most important thing to think about. Because how do you know you're actually innovating? How do you know you're actually changing anything? How do you know you're actually doing anything with a lot of evidence? A lot of what we think and a lot of what we say in cybersecurity and cyber strategy is folklore. It's wisdom handed down without any real tether to knowledge and evidence. We say, I believe, I think. We don't say, I know enough, and that's a challenge. The private sector needs to strengthen defenses. The government is not the primary actor in this domain, and we need to embolden the private sector to act. But we also need to encourage them to act, because quite often they don't act because it's not necessarily in their interest, or it doesn't exactly pay off financially. There's a lot of reform to do in terms of society. In terms of government, we need a coordinator in the executive branch. We don't have anyone coordinating the DHS, the DOD, the national intelligence levers. We don't have anyone who is really synthesizing this information and deconflicting what goes on in government. And that's really something that, I was personally shocked to find out about that if the DOJ indicts someone for a cyber crime, they didn't necessarily talk to the DOD. They didn't necessarily talk to the CIA or the NSA about those indictments. We lack coordination at higher levels of government, and that needs to change. We need to streamline cybersecurity committees in Congress. Depending on how you count, you can find anywhere from 30 to 60 committees in U.S. Congress that deal with technology. We need to streamline this and put it in one place. It's as simple as that. We need to enable the new Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, CISA, within the DHS. We need to enable them to do their mission. We need to think about possibly splitting them off from the DHS. But that's a big pill to chew on right now. But at some point, that needs to happen. We need to enhance U.S. Cyber Command. Do they have enough mission forces to deal with the threat? It's not classified to know that we only have 155 cyber mission forces in U.S. Cyber Command. That is not a lot of people. That's about a brigade. We need more. We need to pass legislation to better recruit, develop, and retain cyber talent. We need to stop thinking about there's a necessary path or skill set. There's a lot of different paths towards capability and knowledge in cybersecurity. We need to think about continuity of the economy. We haven't thought a lot about what we're going to do as our economy depends more on digital information and data sharing. We need to think more about ensuring how we're going to continue if things become disrupted. And finally, we need statistics. We have statistics for everything in the United States government. We have a census, we have a Bureau of Statistics, we have almost no statistics for cybersecurity. We don't even know the number and level of threats and incidents that we experience in the United States and the U.S. government. We know very little cumulatively about data on cybersecurity. Towards the end, though, we also need to go back and think a bit about norms and international collaboration. The United States and others have agreed to norms of responsible behavior in cyberspace, but they have largely gone unenforced. We all generally agree what should be done, but we haven't done enough to enforce these mechanisms. We have been outmaneuvered on standards and regulations. This is not anything to do about the China threat, but China has been focused on regulations and outsubmits us by a level of 10 to 1 anytime any international government body seeks regulations. Regulations are an important aspect of normative standards in technological security. We haven't thought enough about a strategy to deal with that from an international perspective. And then we also need to focus engagement on the UN group of government experts. What ended up happening is Russia and China split the UN, and they split the UN cybersecurity process from the UN group of government experts, and they made an open-ended working group. The open-ended working group takes solicitations and information and communications from anyone. The UN group of government experts focuses on qualified experts from the main players in cyberspace. The play by Russia and China is to degrade international normative collaboration by flooding the zone. We need to go back and think about a focused and clear examination of how cyberspace might work in the UN. But we haven't been strong in that space, mainly because we have neglected how the Department of State operates in cyberspace. And finally, I'll leave you with a few future tasks. There are a few things we haven't done well enough. There are a few things we haven't been able to really dive into well on. We haven't really thought about how to enable innovation. There was an interesting War on the Rocks piece 2 days ago about how we need a U.S. Innovation Command. Now, that might be a bridge too far right now, but we need to think about how we streamline innovation throughout the U.S. military. Every branch of the U.S. military right now is trying to build a multi-domain combat system, and they're doing it separately. Now, we have a problem with collaboration and communication between even the Navy and the Marines. Think about how bad this will get if each branch has their own military multi-domain combat system. We need to streamline innovation, but we tend to typically enable each group to develop innovation on its own. There's a lot we can do in collaboration. There's a lot we can do to enable people to develop software and solutions on their own through startups and through different tasks. But we haven't thought enough about this. We haven't thought about how we measure success enough. We haven't thought if we understand and we're on the right path. This is a pathology throughout all of U.S. foreign policy, but it's a particular pathology in cybersecurity because we lack data. How do we know we're doing the right thing? We cannot operate as a U.S. government and we cannot operate as a strategic organization without any clarity of concepts about success and effectiveness. That betrays everything we think and know about progress in this world. We need to enhance cybersecurity education. We need to think about the NSA Centers of Excellence, who works there, who goes there, how we funnel talent from organizations like this towards the private sector and towards the U.S. government. And we need to think about how we can help the U.S. government retain talent, how we can help the U.S. government work with the private sector, how we can better build a new National Guard and a new strategic reserves to empower people with technological capability who want to help and serve the U.S. government. We haven't thought enough about that. And finally, though, we think a bit too much about this mythical concept of cyber war. Cyber war isn't happening. It's not going to happen. Cyber is an enabler for this full spectrum of U.S. military capabilities. It's not a solo capability on its own. But within this space, we have seen and we will continue to see states use cyber technologies to repress their populations. That's the real efficacy of cybersecurity as a lever of national power. It's useful to repress your population. It's useful to control your population. It's not useful to compel Russia to change their behavior, but it's useful to compel individuals within a state to change their behavior. So in short, we're at a crossing point, really. We're at a disjuncture. Cybersecurity has been an aspect of U.S. national policy for near 30 years. The people who first articulated this threat in the 70s and 80s have long since retired. We met the challenge of 9/11. We met the challenge of everyone who did information warfare, moving towards terrorism, and kind of stripping the entire field of knowledge. And we have rebuilt the field in the 2000s. We rebuilt what we mean by cybersecurity. But we haven't rebuilt national policy well enough. We haven't thought enough about a whole nation strategy. We haven't thought enough about how we're going to protect our citizens and our nation from threats in cyberspace. We tend to over-inflate the threats. We tend to make them mythical. We tend to make them futuristic. In reality, we are able to deal with these threats in a clear and concentrated manner, but it requires novelty, it requires effort, and it requires a desire to change. And that is particularly what we often lack in government, a desire to change. But it's good to be here. It's good to be with students. It's good to be with the future because you are not deterred against change. You are not put off by this challenge. This is a challenge we all have to meet, but we cannot continue on the same path. We have to do and think differently if we're going to ensure our security as a nation and if we're going to ensure our way of life. All right. I'll take questions now.
Hi there. So you talked about, all these different branches of the armed forces not communicating on trying to just kind of attack these cyber threats. Would it honestly be cheaper and probably a better strategy if they were working together?
Yeah, and that's something we need to encourage. I think too often in the U.S. government, every organization kind of operates on their own, and we don't collaborate. And when we do collaborate, we make these joint task forces where people meet and nothing actually gets done. And it becomes a joke at some point. There's not enough unity, there's not enough clarity. And we need someone to really take hold on this. But no one's really done this in the last, even through the Obama administration. And it's something we need to do to move forward and to ensure security.
You spoke a little bit on the unique challenges that the United States faces with democratic values and the scale of our global military influence. But while I was listening to you, I couldn't help but wonder if the same presentation might have been given at some point in Chinese or Korean or German. In your experience, have you found that any other nation state sort of has their ducks in a row in this space? Or are they all in the same boat asking the same questions that you are?
Well, I think that's one of the problems. I think a lot of states, particularly Western and NATO states, are taking our lead. They're not exactly moving on their own. Brazil is an interesting case in moving on its own. They articulate a whole society approach. They focus on education. China, of course, has different threats. And China, of course, has their ducks in the row in terms of how they're going to orientate to deal with their challenges. But their challenges are more immense than our challenges, because they not only have to worry about external actors or us, they have to worry about the internal threat. And that's not necessarily something we have to worry about. So while they may be more organized for the challenge, they're not exactly more capable given the scale of the threat. So there's variation. And I think there's something novel and there's something interesting in the future to look at, say, the middle states, like the Singapores of this world, the Latin American states, the ones who are not necessarily at the front lines, and see how they're going to evolve cyber strategy, because their threats and their challenges are different than ours.
Thank you.
Hi, Kara Zajac. Do you think the lack of transparency in America's strategy and red lines not being published is a strength, as it gives the United States a gray area to operate in, along with a way to react differently for each adversary attacking us, so we can,
Yeah, I mean, and this is a problem because in terms of U.S. military strategy, we often encourage flexibility. And flexibility allows us to do, and I said this phrase, and it's a phrase you learn when you work in U.S. government, to respond at a time and place of our choosing. But if we're going to say that things cannot be done, that states cannot do certain things towards us, we need to be clear on what we're trying to prevent. And that's the reality, is that if we want to forestall election tampering, industrial espionage at an international state level, international crime, even China just snapping up Marriott and Equifax data, you need to tell them what they cannot do, and you need to enfranchise costs for these operations. So we're going to lose flexibility. But that's something that's necessary if we're going to cry about the damage and the harm that's done to us. Because you cannot complain about damage and harm if you never say, well, that's something we didn't want you to do in the first place. And that's been a challenge with U.S. national cyber strategy for a long time.
That's one more question. Sorry, one more question too, and thank you. Do you think the single greatest cyber threat facing America in the next 10 years is going to be more internal, as in our lack of strong policy and bipartisan support on strong cyber laws is going to be greater, or do you think it'll be external, as in the Russia's, China's, attacking us?
Yeah, I would say it's going to be internal. And, one way I would articulate this is I was listening to a Senate hearing, and they explained to this senator, well, if we go on the offense, if we do this, this, and this, it's going to be like throwing rocks in a glass house. And the senator said, damn it, I want to throw rocks in a glass house. This is the problem, is that we're not listening. We're not thinking about the strategic challenge and how we need to embolden the defense. There's a lot of sectors, like say the water sector, that has very clear cybersecurity threats, but they're not even spending any money on this because it doesn't rank very high on their list of threats. We need to wake up to the threat of cybersecurity to all aspects of life, and this is an internal challenge. Because if you're going to go on the offense, you need to have your defense shored up first.
Thank you.
No problem.
So you talked about enabling interagency innovation, but with the red tape and bureaucracy in American government, do you think that it would be inefficient to ask the agencies to cooperate with each other just for the sole reason that it would take longer to get those strategies into place?
Well, what's interesting is there's innovation, there's new methods of innovation in the U.S. government that we need to start to spread out. Like there's something you can look up, it's called the Kessel Run, which of course is a reference to Star Wars and Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon and all that. But the Kessel Run is a software organization in the U.S. government and U.S. military to embolden software solutions at the unit level. There are things like that that are useful for breaking down the red tape. But, you know, quite often we let the red tape stop us. And that's really a challenge. You know, we can do better. And we particularly have to do better in the technological space.
Thank you.
Sure.
Good evening, sir. My question is sort of addressing the presentation as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Given that we are not necessarily going to be in a position to implement some of the large-scale and sweeping changes that you've recommended in this presentation, what do you recommend that we as students entering the industry from the ground level change or do with the resources that we're given in order to make relevant what is presented in your slides?
From my perspective, I think it's challenge the orthodoxy. Challenge the conventional wisdom. Deconstruct things. I think that's the most important thing you can do because you're bringing a fresh view and a fresh look on things. And too often people like me get set in their ways and they get stuck in a job for 10 years and they're not willing to think outside the box. I think that's the most important thing people like you can bring to this space. New and novel ways of thinking. That's really important. Don't fall into the collective DC groupthink. I think they want us to wrap up, but I'm sorry I've ignored you over there. I didn't see you there.
Yeah, my question is, so earlier you said change is difficult as like it's hard to get people to buy into change, especially with like end users who aren't security focused. Often force, I think, is used, such as like complex like password requirements that can sometimes just complicate the issue instead of actually fix the problem. So is there a way to create this change without just forcing users to like blindly change what they're doing in the realm of security?
Well, I think one thing that we don't talk about enough in cybersecurity, I mentioned a little bit here, is regulations and standards. That's a way we can enforce change. That's a power U.S. Congress has to enforce change. That's a power the executive branch has through executive orders. That if we require certain standards and regulations, then things can change and we can force something new to happen. But agreeing on what we want those regulations to be is difficult. And we actually, frankly, operate in a space where we believe that we need to reduce regulations. But regulations are what are important in terms of making our drinking water safe and making sure we have clear standards of accreditation for colleges. Regulations and standards are important, particularly in terms of technology. And we've been too static in this space for too long.
Awesome.
Think you're last?
Yeah, I'm going to turn this down a little bit. Okay, so I have several questions. Well, not several, but quite a few. Okay, so in the very beginning, you were talking about strategies, and usually when it came to strategizing throughout time, we learn from what has happened. So with that said, how are we supposed to learn and understand what are we supposed to set up when we haven't experienced all of these attacks or something like that? So that's the first one. Do you want to just answer as we go? Or I could just pick out the really important ones.
You know, this is a challenge, though, because I think thinking strategically is something you build towards. And you start to get there through experiencing the individual parts. And then you start to think about the whole. But thinking about the whole very early is very, very difficult. So I think you need to build towards that at some point. Like I mean, this is my 20th year in my career. I would not give this talk in my first or second year, but now I feel like it. I think they want to let you ask like one more. So pick your favorite one.
Okay, my favorite. All right, so when it came to foreshadowing behavior, when you said like a social construct, like as a nation, do you think, an example, what happened in 2008 with the economic, crash, it was mandated that every high school or, schooling had to do personal financing and other financing, stuff like that. So do you think having a classroom that's mandated about cybersecurity and not just knowing, oh, your password's long, but actually getting into not the nitty gritty, but enough to protect yourself would be a necessary need to protect our society?
And I think even more importantly around that is thinking about knowledge and truth, and what is true and what is not, and what might be a fact and what isn't. So getting back to that basic idea of civic education isn't something we've evolved and reformed, but it's something that we need to start to think about. Because there's a simple aspect of data integrity and passwords, but there's also a simple aspect of just understanding what might be a reputable credit card to apply for, things like this, and not giving your information away to some shoddy, group in another country. That's something we need to teach and start to learn about, but I don't know how we get there particularly.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So, Dr. Valeriano, thanks for coming again today. Great introduction to the problems that our audience is going to face. I'm very confident that the answers and the solutions that you brought up about strategy are out there with these young folks today. So, on behalf of the superintendent, the staff and faculty, and our great Corps of Cadets, thanks again for coming today and leading off with this presentation. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.